Hey everyone, this is Pete, and welcome back to Atari ST A to Z, a series of short playthroughs of Atari ST games, some which I grew up with and some which are new to me. Today is one of the format. Today we're looking at Cracked, or possibly Cracked. I've never quite been sure how to pronounce it because there's an apostrophe in the middle that shouldn't be there. But anyway, this was a 1988 release from Atari, developed by a guy called Robert Craig, who is credited as Robert Neen, or Robert Nene, back at the time for some reason. And this was one of the earliest mouse pointer driven shooting games, so sort of the similar idea to a light gun shooter but using a mouse pointer instead. And it also had a catch mechanic in this. So the idea of the game is that you're protecting nests of eggs from things that want to steal them. And if you shoot something that's carrying an egg, you can use your mouse pointer to actually catch the egg and then put it back in the nest as well. So that was something that distinguished it from other light gun shooters at the time. So a few interesting bits and pieces about this, because Craig actually gave an interview to a website back in 2003. The website's now offline, unfortunately, but it is archived online. And he shared a few bits of information about the game's development and all sort of life at Atari at the time, and it's pretty interesting. So the things that jumped out to me from his interview were that he found himself quite annoyed at the fact that Atari executives pretty much demanded a console port of this, despite the fact that he designed it from the ground up to be a mouse-driven game. So there ended up being an Atari 7800 version that completely bombed. Completely unsurprising, Craig. And there was a 2600 version that never got released. Prototypes of that did make it out into the wild, and people seem to think that it would have made quite a good 2600 game, but that never happened for one reason or another. So in this interview, Craig also shared a little bit about Atari Culture at the time. And apparently, sort of around this period, 1988 or so, Atari had a blue sky room, they called it, that was full of toys and games and that sort of thing. And people were encouraged to go in there and play around with the toys and look at the games and that sort of thing, and use those ideas for game development. It wasn't a guarantee that they would be able to make those games, because Craig also talks about being delighted when Atari had actually accepted his pitch for this game. But yeah, it was sort of a built-in place for people to go and draw inspiration from. Craig was a self-taught programmer, but this was pretty much the only game that he made for the Atari ST. He did some stuff for other platforms, but shortly after making this, he discovered that hacking was more profitable. So he spent a lot of his time sort of cracking protection systems and that sort of thing. And he sort of made it a personal challenge for himself to crack the uncrackable things. He gave an example of D-Base on the PC, deliberately incorporating a physical defect into its disks that made it very difficult to copy them. And he managed to find a way around that, for example, and various other things as well. And he found that profitable somehow. I'm not entirely sure how, but probably best not to ask. But in 2003, he was still working in the industry. He was working on online games. So he was working on browser-based games, early cell phone games, games for cable set-top boxes and that sort of thing. Not sure if he's still doing that now, but back in 2003, he seemed to be pretty happy doing that. He was... in fact, his exact words were he was making those old schools new and fresh again. So he seemed pretty happy, so maybe he's still doing it. I don't know. I can't find any sort of contemporary information on him. But anyway, here is Cracked. This is one of a number of Atari releases that came out in these sort of cassette box formats type thing. So it's sort of a double cassette box size here. And inside we've got the disc, sort of lovely gold print on it. And then the instructions are actually part of the inlay rather than a separate booklet or anything. So let's have a little look at the blurb on the back first of all. So, as a professional ornithologist, you're thrilled to find out that some rare South American hornbills have nested in your old oak tree. But while the hornbills are out feeding even, a group of mischievous bluebirds, owls and snakes begin raiding their nests and stealing eggs. Horrified, you get out your slingshot and begin hitting the marauding creatures, but you have to be careful. If you hit an egg-carrying bird, it drops the egg and you have to act fast to catch it before it hits the ground and return it to a nest. At the same time, you have to watch for snakes that may be sneaking up to nests and gobbling eggs. If you can protect the eggs long enough, you can take them to another nesting site. But watch out, egg-stealing creatures are everywhere. Yeah, so there's a bit of information about how to actually play the game there, and then we've got sort of scoring information for the various enemies in this one. So creatures that you will come across are bluebirds, aliens, rats, dunglings, which are basically poo monsters, bubbles, anchovies, squids, spaceships, skeletons, ghosts, owls, meteors, dragonflies, snakes, and bats. I've a strange memory of this game, is specifically to do with the dungling creatures, which I found terribly amusing as a kid in 1988, of course. And I sort of found them so striking that when I got to secondary school, me and my friends used to love drawing little cartoons and silly things and doodling in our books and that sort of thing. It was always got us in trouble, but we liked it anyway. And yeah, one of the things I used to like drawing was something I called the toilet people, which are basically they were dunglings basically, and they sort of sat inside the toilet and sort of looked over the rim and poked out, and they were always going like that. And they were inspired by Cracked. So that's nice, isn't it? Never went anywhere with that, but just thought I'd tell you that story because, you know, stories are fun. Anyway, let's go play Cracked. Okay, here we are with Cracked from Atari, or Cracked if you prefer, by Robert Neve. Additional graphics by Clark Kahanick and Donna Ford. Special thanks to Rachel, Tari and Kit Jacoby, Randy and Jill Smith, and Lonnie Nelson. Lonnie Nelson? I think I know that. Oh, yeah, I think I follow her on Twitter. She was sort of quite active during that controversy a little while back where Nolan Bushnell was sort of stripped of that award because of that ridiculous sexism row. But let's not get dragged down by negatives. Let's play Cracked, because this is a fun game. Pretty simple and straightforward game. But, oh dear. And I still have to adjust to how the mouse handles on here. And so your aim then is to just blast all the things that are trying to steal the eggs. You don't have a ammunition limit or anything like that, but you do have a time limit. The time limit's a good thing because that's how long you have to survive until the next level. And so on this first stage, which is the old yoke tree, I think it is, you're fighting off these bluebirds and snakes and stuff, and the snakes will grab the eggs and then immediately eat them, whereas the birds will try and pick them up and carry them away. And so because it's quite difficult to hold on to all of your eggs at any one moment, you kind of have to prioritize your targets a bit and go for the most strategically advantageous places to keep your eggs, because as you can see, it's very difficult to deal with the snakes because they're low down the screen. So if you shoot a snake, you've only got a split second to actually recover the egg that they steal before it smashes on the floor. Alright, you finish the first level with just one egg remaining. That's not too good. And then you have this stage here where you have to... Oops. You have to chuck eggs at the rooster by using these sort of X and Y indicators. So you don't have a straight aiming sight on this one. You have to do it entirely using the arrows. And you have to do it before the rooster chucks an egg at you, which is quite difficult. Yeah, having a bit of trouble here. Oh, that was the closest we got, I think. Come on, over it. Yeah, we got the usual problem with ST mouse controls games, which is that the mouse isn't terribly responsive, so... Oh, so close. I got him. So you see, when you actually hit him, that doesn't cost you an egg. There we go. But every time you do miss him, you lose one of those eggs. Alright, continuing on to the next stage, which is the sewers. We still only have one egg to defend. There are the dunglings, and they turn into toilets when they are destroyed. Which is the main reason that I turned them into the toilet people, as I described in the intro. So yeah, this is a... Oh no! Game over. Right, I'm going to have to try that again to do better than that. Yeah, this is a really simple and charming little game, but I used to enjoy playing this back in the day because it was a sort of arcadey type experience. But it was also unique to the ST as well. So rather than being an arcade port... Oops. It was something you couldn't get anywhere else. And it was something a bit different as well. So I really like the fact that this was a shooting game that wasn't about soldiers. It wasn't a military game. Oh, missed. So the catching mechanic, if you were wondering, that works by you holding down the right mouse button, and that causes your sight to expand. And when your sight is expanded like that, as long as you position it correctly, you can catch the eggs. Oh god, really struggling with these controls. I think it's nearly all over. It's strange how your sort of muscle memory changes over time, because I don't remember having a real issue with the ST's mouse at all when I was a kid, but trying to use it now, when compared to the way a modern mouse on a Windows or Mac based system works, it's very hard to adjust to. I don't know if that's something to do with the resolution it's running at, or just the overall responsiveness of it. I know that being a mechanical mouse, the ST's mouse is somewhat less responsive than a lot of modern mice, but I think the resolution has something to do with it as well, because we're dealing with a 320 by 200 display here, and so there's only so it can only be so accurate at that resolution, whereas now we're dealing with like 1080p displays, which are obviously a lot more conducive to accuracy and precision. We're doing a bit better now. Still pretty woeful number of eggs left, but we're not doing terribly. Come here, you... Nah. Grab it. Oh, bollocks. Yeah, I think the main appeal of this game for me, both back in the day and now in fact, is sort of the amount of personality it's got to it. So there's a lot of character to the different enemies, and the rooster, and the silly animations they play when you shoot one of them, and the way the rooster chucks the egg at the screen and it drips down the screen at you. There's just obviously a lot of effort being made to make this a game that has a feeling of personality about it. Oh, you lose points if he hits you. Well, that sucks. Yeah, and for me, that's one thing about sort of Atari's early games is, at least partly because a lot of them were sort of struggling to define genres at the time, is some of them lack what you might describe as personality today. Although they're fun, some of them are quite dry in terms of subject matter. Like if you look at some of the things that we're covering on the Atari A to Z flashback series at the moment, particularly the 2600 titles, I mean, the lack of sort of characterization and visual personality in those games was mostly down to technical limitations, of course, but it does mean that there's a distinctive feeling to those games that if you're a fan of sort of cartoony presentation and that sort of thing, it might feel like they're lacking. Whereas Cracked here was obviously designed right away to be a cool looking game with interesting, funny, silly characters. Ridiculous animations, crazy situations, and an unaimable cursor. Yeah, you saw in the intro I had my own copy of this. I actually forget how I came into possession of that, because I remember it being slightly unusual circumstances for some reason. I think it was someone just gave it to me, I think. Because either they didn't have their ST anymore or they weren't using it or something like that. And so... It's all over. Yeah, and I remember them giving me like a collection of Atari games for the ST. And I remember being quite surprised by that at that point, actually, because I was... By that point, I was already kind of working under the assumption that Atari had sort of pretty much given up on trying to do things itself, at least in terms of home computers. Which is not an unreasonable assumption, if you know anything about the sort of Atari's history of poor marketing decisions. But... yeah, so I was quite surprised to discover over the years quite how many ST games that Atari actually published. Including some of their classic arcade versions, like Crystal Castles, Asteroids, Moon Patrol, that sort of thing. But also original stuff as well. So there was a period sort of midway through the ST's life where they really sort of seemed to almost try to pick themselves up a bit. After sort of struggling in second place for so long, they were sort of making a real effort to try and publish a lot more software. And so, as well as games, they were putting out productivity software, like drawing software and publishing software as well. And they were sort of doing specific series of games for particular audiences as well. So there were games that came in red boxes that were sort of designed for sort of what we'd refer to as core gamers these days. So the people who were interested in shooting things and flying spaceships and that sort of thing. But then they also did a series of games in blue boxes as well, that were games given a sort of slightly more serious treatment. So in that series they released a version of Backgammon and a version of I don't think it actually was Go specifically, but it was Gomaku or something like that. Gomaku and Renju, I think. And they came out in blue boxes, and they were deliberately presented to be quite dry. And so it was almost like they were marketing games to non-games players. And I thought that was a really interesting approach, having these different series of things that they did. And then Cracked here came out as part of a series of budget price releases that were released in those sort of low-cost cassette-style boxes, like I said, and as I showed you in the intro. And so for a time, they were really trying. It's just a bit of a shame that they didn't sort of keep up that momentum. because the ST had a whole lot to offer. It's quite correctly regarded as inferior to the Amiga in a lot of ways, but there are certain things that the ST has always done better, and in fact there are people out there still using the ST for things like MIDI sequence and so on, just because it's such a good platform for those things. I don't think we're getting past this level, are we? But yeah, the ST was... Actually, I don't know if I want to say it was the start. I think it was... It kind of started as early as the Atari 8-bit thing, where the Atari really struggling to sort of define what made its systems unique. And that was something that the users were a lot better at than Atari themselves. Sort of the writers of magazines and the people who wrote programs and all that sort of thing. And so I think Atari sort of leaned on them a bit too much, almost, to kind of define what was special about these systems. Yeah, I've kind of got a bit off track there, haven't I? But yeah, it's worth considering, and sort of from the perspective of history, I think this is quite an interesting game for being an Atari published game on the ST. Sort of showing that there was a time when they were kind of taking things a bit more seriously and trying to really push their own systems before it all fell apart. But oh well, things happen, times change, and it's not as if we can't still enjoy these games now as we're doing today. Anyway, for now, I'll just say, as always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again next time. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please help out the channel by leaving a like or a comment and subscribing. New episodes of Atari A to Z are on Tuesdays and Atari ST A to Z on Thursdays. Check out atariatoz.wordpress.com for a full archive. Do please also check out my other projects, moegamer.net, where I explore Japanese and Japanese-inspired games from yesterday and today, and videopackgames.wordpress.com, which aims to catalogue a small but well-formed library of the Philips G7000 Videopack computer, also known as the Magnavox Odyssey 2. You can also support my work on Patreon or buy me a coffee. You can find links to do both down in the video description. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.